Welcome back. If you're just joining us, it's Daybreak on Trust Television. As Abdul said before we went on that short break, we'll be doubling down on our conversation around the Workers' Day. Every year, the International Labour Day is celebrated to spread awareness about the struggles of the working class of society. It is also an opportunity to mark the contribution of the worker, and in this case, the Nigerian worker. It is a day to recognize their efforts and contribution to the development of society, and if you like, to the country. This day, laborers. Okay, basically, the theme for this year, Workers' Day, is to ensure workplace safety and health amidst climate change. And to discuss this, we have in the studio the president of the Senior Staff Association of Nigerian Universities, SANU. It's a pleasure to have you join us this morning.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Thank
you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We are juggling several things this morning between live feeds from our colleagues who are covering the event across various states of the Federation, and of course here in Abuja. And we have our guest here joining us to give us a sense of why you chose this theme, what's the relevance of this theme to the International Workers' Day, and how does that reflect the Nigerian situation?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, Nigerians. Happy Workers' Day to all of us. I think it's also important for Nigerians and our viewers to understand that today is like you can either call it Salah Day or Christmas Day to the worker, because this is like a freedom day. You know, it dates back to the 19th century, precisely 1886, when workers fought for their independence to have 8 hours of work in America, and they got it. But it was not something that was on a platter of gold. So a lot of people paid the supreme price. Some people were killed, some people were maimed, some people were sacked, and a lot of things happened. And therefore, for every worker in the world, or in most of our countries around the world, today is being celebrated by workers to stay at home, to do some merriment, to lament, to jubilate, as the case may be. For us in Nigeria, I don't think workers are in the right frame of mind to actually jubilate, but probably to also do some sober reflection to see where we are coming from, and whether we have been able to face those challenges. Going back to directly your question about the theme, climate change is something that is real. It's something that everybody knows that is facing us and staring us the face. I just came in from Adamawa 2 days ago, and I can tell you that in the last 30 years, we've not had a hot weather like what we witness or witnessing currently. People suffering from heat waves, and it's not only in Adamawa but across Nigeria, across the world. Deforestation, a lot of things that were unthinkable, are now taking place. So workers are also human beings. They are also people who take part in daily activities around the world, around Nigeria. So whatever you need to do, whatever that is current, whatever that is being discussed, they shouldn't be left out. And therefore, if we are talking about climate change, definitely workers also have a role to play, because we are either taking part in helping the situation or aggravating the situation. So this is exactly what is happening.
And give me a sense, comrade, what you make of how, especially when these days come around every other year, we are overly focused on one thing and one thing mostly, when we're talking about Nigerian workers, for instance, and that is their welfare. I mean, climate change is important, but for the most part, we're talking about right now, the next minimum wage. What would it look like as Nigerians continue to discuss the current economic climate? The various bodies under the umbrella of the NLC, for instance, and the TUC have one issue or the other with the federal government. I mean, your association, for instance, just weeks ago, had to go on a 1 week strike to drive home the same issue around welfare, around the entitlements of your members and things like that. What is your sense of how big this challenge is and what impact it is having on the lives and livelihood of Nigerian workers, especially as we talk about everyday situations that is connected to climate change, for instance?
Well, Oko, to add to what you said in the intro, apart from being the national president of SANU, I am also the national internal auditor of the Nigeria Labour Congress, and therefore I sit at the highest level of
decision making,
decision and policy making for the Nigerian workers. And we spent the whole of yesterday, discussing, analyzing issues about workers and the working class, and even people who are in the informal sector. Welfare and well-being clearly is the mandate of the Nigeria Labour Congress and all other labor unions. And therefore, you also need to understand that without workers, the economy will not even move, will not even grow. We oil the engine, of the economy. We drive the economy, whether in the manufacturing sector, education sector, agricultural sector, or anywhere. And we, at the level of NLC, what we do is we try to organize even workers so that they don't agonize. They come together, form a platform, get registered with the Ministry of Labor, and then come under the umbrella of NLC or, as the case may be, TUC, where proper guidance will be given as to how to now drive those challenges, how to ensure that their voices are heard, how to ensure that they relate with their employers, at the level of discourse that will not unnecessarily become an issue of striking, fighting, struggling, and here and there. So what we do is that we keep advocating to our employers of labor to understand that when you make the workers' life simple, when you make it interesting, when you make it lively, you get your job done without much ado. Today, people have been talking about corruption, especially among civil servants. But is it the noise making that will solve the problem? Our leaders should understand that those civil servants that you have been accusing of corruption, you need to study and get to know what is the reason why, or what are the reasons why people engage in corruption. I'm not saying that corruption is something that should be, encouraged or it should be tolerated. But then, what are the motives? What is pushing people into doing this? Basically, in Nigeria, the challenge is, as a family man, you must feed your family, you must educate your children, you must give security to your family and to your life, you must move from one location to another, and you must ensure that also other social services are given to you. But is that the case? The answer is no.
All right. I think we more than understand how crucial the concept of fighting corruption is vis-a-vis providing adequate welfare. And I'm also happy that you informed our viewers that you are also part of the highest decision-making body of the NLC. Just yesterday, the government, the Salaries and Wages Commission announced some sort of increment in salary, if you like, in welfare. And we're struggling to make sense of that in the light of the fact that we know that there is an ongoing conversation on wages, which you guys are heavily involved in. Can you give us a sense of what is stalling that whole conversation, and what do you make? Yeah, we've seen some of the initial statements that you have issued, but when that information came out yesterday, how did you guys receive it? What is your perception of what the government is driving at with that announcement?
Well, first of all, anything that will add to the betterment of any worker is something that should be appreciated. So therefore, without mincing words, we will not say that what was done was wrong. But is that what we need? No. We've been talking about minimum wage, new minimum wage. Minimum wage is a law in Nigeria. It's a law. And that it has a 5-year lifespan. The minimum wage that we've been receiving, or that Nigeria has approved as a law, elapsed on the 18th of April. This year, just last week. Is it some 2 weeks back? So now, what is expected, or what was expected, was that before the expiry of the minimum wage that was signed by the former President Buhari in 2019, the new one should have taken effect a day after. And therefore, the process or processes should have started much earlier. Should have been maybe in October, November, because it's a whole lot of process. And that you need to also understand that it's a tripartite kind of setting. There is the public sector, the private sector, and then the state government under the public sector, the subnationals. So therefore, it is not something that will be done out of fiat. For example, the federal government will just wake up one day and say, I'm imposing X amount as minimum wage for workers in Nigeria. The state governments have the right to say they cannot afford to do that. The private sector, the same thing. Now, because of the slow nature of how government works, which is quite unfortunate, today we have had the last minimum wage, expired, and we have not, seen the new minimum wage, and that a lot of people were expecting that worst case scenario, today being the 1st of May, Workers' Day, probably the new minimum wage would be announced. But minimum wage law is not something that can be announced just by one person. Like I said, the committees have been meeting, even though embarrassingly slow, because I am aware that the committee, the tripartite committee, has not met, for example, in the last 3 weeks to,
What does that signpost, Comrade? What does that signpost? What does this snail pace tell you about the commitment to give Nigerians an improved and revised minimum wage?
What clearly this shows is that our leaders are not, receptive to the betterment of the workers' life. Because if they have taken it as a very serious issue, like I said, by now this thing would have been nipped in the bud. But because things are done, at a snail speed, today we are having this kind of problem. Therefore, what workers expect in Nigeria, whether they are in private sector or in public sector or in the subnationals, what we are expecting is that we need a living wage, a minimum wage that should be able to come to the rescue of Nigerians. Today, what we have staring in on our faces are bills that we cannot even afford to, pay. Is it electricity? Is it the long queues of fuel that you see today? A liter is now sold in the black market at the rate of 1,200, 1,500 naira. And you know how this has changed, drastically, negatively also, the prices of commodities in the market. So whatever you are to be given today, the real economic value has been washed away.
Just to follow up with this very critical point that you have made, the arguments abound in various sectors in Nigeria that the whole conversation about a living wage, now not just the minimum wage, a living wage, is not just about the size of the number. It is about structural issues that also needs to be fixed. It's about inflation coming down to a single digit. Currently, food inflation hovers around 40%. So if you get 100 naira, you probably spend 40 naira trying to get a basic meal, to put it at the barest minimum. So the question really is, do we have this kind of understanding feeding into that conversation you are having? Because what we hear from the outside is how labor is asking for 600 and so thousand or 300 and something thousand. And so the impression to us is, are we really serious about having these conversations? Is there something labor knows that most of us don't, because the government is saying they are practically bankrupt? Where are we going to? Are we going to practically borrow this country out just to satisfy the earnings of our labor force? How is that practicable? The amount that we seem to be asking of, as against fixing structural issues that would then make whatever we are getting afford some quality life for us.
Who are the people fixing the structural issues? Who are the people? Are they not the workers? Would they do that on empty stomach? The labor union, especially NLC, I can tell you for free, that is made up of people who are reasonable, who are practical, and who are sincere. And we have an economic department in NLC where issues about the economy is researched and is handled, and whatever information or message is churned out is done from the point of view of knowledge. So if Labour today says that we are asking for 1 million naira as a minimum wage, it was not just out of the blues. We would have done some comparisons. We would have also seen what the purchasing power of Nigerians is and what that money can, do. And you remember I just mentioned to you, in some state governments, it's quite absurd that a director still collects less than 200,000 naira as a take-home salary. And this is someone who will process a file of 1 billion naira contract. And you expect him to do this without much ado? You expect him to do this without necessarily looking elsewhere or looking looking deeply to delay and ensure that he also gets something out of this? These are some of the things. Take care of your workers. Make sure that their lives and livelihoods is catered for, and be sure that services will be rendered. You employ people, you don't pay them well. When you pay delayed, mutilated, amounts and salaries, and therefore you expect magic to happen. It's not possible. So whatever the labor asks for is for and on behalf of the workers. And it is because it is also practical. And we also understand that if you don't pay workers well, that engine that moves the economy will not be oiled well, and it will not be driven, successfully. Right. So this is why Labour is always advocating for a living wage, for wages that can, make our workers, independent from poverty. Right. So this is very important for Nigerians to understand. Right. So Labour is not saying that you carry the whole money of this country and give workers and then leave other, sectors to suffer. No, but because we also drive the economy. And therefore, we need to also have something because it's an input and output, situation.
And in talking about relationships, right? I think historically the organized labor and the government have always had this frosty relationship, where it's not always cordial. It's always, a fight between what labor wants, what the government is pushing back on, or what the government is pushing and what labor is pushing back on with regards to economic reforms and things like that. Subsidy removal, case in point, for instance, as a sore point when organized labor pushed back on why subsidies should not be removed, especially on petroleum products like PMS, for instance. Give me a sense of how you would characterize the relationship between the current organized labor and the Tinubu administration that is about to mark its first year in office. How would you characterize this relationship? I mean, would you say they are labor friendly?
Well, to sit in a studio like this and give a graphic analysis of what the relationship looks like would be just academic in nature. But Nigerians are there to see whether or not the government is performing or whether or not the relationship is frosty or cordial. But obviously, 1 year that this government will mark by the end of this month will mark a milestone in the history of labor movement and the relationship between the workers and the government. Yes, we have seen increases in some sectors in terms of payment of allowances, but we have also seen a quadruple, withdrawal of, certain things like the subsidy in petroleum, which you mentioned, in electricity, which has eaten up whatever good that has been put. So it's like the case of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So workers will jubilate in the morning and cry in the night. This is what is happening. Whatever is given is also taken away. Today, you cannot, as a worker in this country, smile throughout the day, because whatever you buy in the morning at X amount, you are not sure of buying it in the evening on the same amount. That is enough. That is enough punishment for workers. So we have been drawing the attention of our leaders and those in government to understand that sitting down to negotiate with labor should not be seen as a battle or as war, that you need to kill certain people. No. Workers under the umbrella of the labor unions are there simply to organize and make government understand the need to do the right thing. So he mentioned the issue of inflation, that clearly today is something that you cannot get the best economist in the world. If you bring him here, he cannot explain it, because it's not, the indices are just, they have gone way well, it's like the case of, you throwing a bomb in the marketplace. So everybody is just running helter-skelter. You don't even know where you are heading to.
All right.
So what one can describe in the name of whether the relationship is frosty or it is cordial, I would rather say that let Nigerians judge.
The proof is in eating the pudding, isn't it?
All right. One question I would not miss the opportunity to ask before we let you go, of course, is perhaps I would get an internal assessment from you of what you think, how well do you think you have fared? Because the last minimum wage, which expired about 2 weeks ago, like you mentioned, still have several states that have not complied. Is it a case of once you get the federal government to comply, and some of your members in the states who are suffering from non-compliance are in the minority, you just sort of say, oh, on a scale, we seem to have done a 70 to 30 ratio, so we have done well, that's a pass mark, we move on, and it doesn't matter whether these states come up. What did you do at some of these places to make sure that justice for one is justice for all?
Well, you see, because Nigeria is a federation, is operating a federal system, and therefore there are certain things that you do at the level of federal, you cannot simply through fiat, enforce at the level of states. But labor, is on the exclusive list. So it's something that the federal government naturally will spearhead, naturally will champion. But in the discussion surrounding minimum wage, like I said, it's a tripartite arrangement. The public sector, the private sector, and the subnationals. So those are the ones that will sit down and agree. So if it was something that would be done through fiat, by now probably it would have been addressed. Now, those politicians who get elected as governors, some of them do not have the fear of God. That is clearly what is happening. Because if they were campaigning, you will hear them say they will do this, they will do that. But when they get there, they throw away all what they have promised. So, because you cannot explain why a state governor in Nigeria would have refused to implement the 30,000 naira expired minimum wage. When there are states, yes, I know the allocation, also come in different forms. But we know that there are states who are even paying more than the 30,000 naira minimum wage. Actually, when they say minimum wage, it's like a benchmark. You can go lower than this,
you shouldn't go higher.
You can go higher, but you shouldn't go below. But how do you expect? And those states, just go back and check. Those states that refuse to do the minimum wage, go and see what is obtainable there. Whether or not the governors and the government in those states are performing. It doesn't really take away anything from you if you make the life of workers, something that is palatable. Because if you make your workers happy, like I said, services are rendered, jobs are executed without much ado. So as we are championing a new minimum wage today, we expect that if at the end of the day the committee settles and all the parties agree to sign, and then eventually Mr. President, the law is transmitted, the bill is transmitted to the National Assembly, we also expect our legislators to also do the needful, and then probably come up with some legislation to ensure that they can even criminalize some of our political actors who antagonize workers by refusing to pay them, those approved minimum wage.
Yeah.
This is what we expect. But truly, what workers desire, whether they are in the government or in the informal sector, what they desire is a living wage. Yeah. And what we need is to ensure that we deliver our services as workers if we are paid handsomely, if we are paid adequately.
Right.
So this is the case in point.
Unfortunately, for the most part, it almost feels as if the Nigerian workers are asking for too much when we can all agree that they're asking for the bare minimum in most cases. And I think there's a consensus that the Nigerian workers have been shortchanged for the longest time. We're going to have to leave the conversation here for now. It's going to be a long day for you, I believe, as a Labour leader yourself. But thank you most kindly for joining us this morning, Comrade Mohammed Ibrahim, President of the Senior Staff Association of Nigerian Universities. I appreciate you most kindly for stopping by this morning, and happy Workers' Day to you too.
Thank you very much. I also wish you once again happy Workers' Day.
It's a pleasure to have you in the studio.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we do come back, we're going to still bring you up to speed with some of the developments as commemorations get underway marking this year's Workers' Day across Nigeria. And of course, after that, we'll take a look at the papers for you to bring you up to speed with the stories making the headlines. Join us after the break.